last one. Oh. Start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting and thought-provoking conference in such a beautiful place. And also would like to thank all of the collaborators on the work that I will be talking about today. And these include a number of graduate students and postdocs in our department at the Cognitive and Neural Systems Department at Boston University, as well as Joe Perkel and colleagues at MIT, and also Shinji Maeda, who has kindly given us his synthesizer that we've used for a lot of the work I'll be talking about. Our lab at Boston University has as a primary goal the elucidation of the neural processes underlying the learning of speech in children, normal speech in adults, and the breakdowns of speech in disorders such as stuttering and apraxia of speech. And I'm going to talk about speech at a sublinguistic level. So when I say speech production, I mean speech motor control, basically, not language. So I'm really talking about the motor control system, but it's very relevant, as we'll see, to many of the issues that have been talked about at a higher level. The methods of investigation that we use in our lab are, first of all, neural network modeling. So we do computational models that we formulate as neurons and synapses, and this allows us to do direct comparisons to neurophysiological data. And we do some functional brain imaging to test key aspects of the model, and I'll focus mostly on our functional neuroimaging work today, as well as the model. And finally, we do a lot of motor and auditory psychophysics, and Joe Perkel was talking about a lot of that work this morning. And the studies I'll be talking about are organized around a model of speech production that we call the DIVA model, and it's a neural network model that learns to control a virtual vocal tract or an articulatory synthesizer, and learns to produce speech sounds that are presented to it to learn. So the talk outline is, first I'll give an overview of the DIVA model, and in this I'll address the issue of mirror neurons, as well as learning in the model, and also how we compare the model's activations to fMRI data. Then I'll talk about the feedback control subsystem of the model. Joe gave an introduction to that this morning, and I'll talk about two key experiments that highlight the neural substrates of this feedback system, and it consists of both an auditory and a somatosensory feedback control subsystem. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about feed-forward control and the interactions between feedback control and feed-forward control in the model. This slide shows an overview of the model, and each of these boxes you can think of as a map of neurons. So each of these we treat as simple neurons, and the arrows between the boxes are synaptic projections from one map of neurons to another map of neurons. And we have the main speech motor areas represented in the model. So we have a motor cortex in the model, which sends commands to the articulatory synthesizer to produce speech sounds. We have an auditory system which can hear the resulting speech that's produced. And we have a somatosensory system which can sense the positions of the articulators that are being used. So we have somatosensory error and state maps, auditory error and state maps, and a motor map with velocity and positions of articulators represented. I'll talk in much more detail about these systems in a bit. And then we also have the highest level in the model, which is what we call the speech sound map. And we think of the speech sound map as existing in left ventral premotor cortex, and as I'll talk about in a moment, it correlates very well with mirror neurons that have been talked about in great detail in this conference. Another way to look at the model is that it's broken up into two control subsystems. We have a feed-forward control subsystem, and what I mean by feed-forward control is commands that are read out without waiting for the consequences. The system doesn't have to wait to hear what's coming out. It just reads out a pre-learned command. So these are pre-learned commands that are read out. They have to be learned, and I'll describe that process in great detail. And then there's the feedback control subsystem, which basically compares what is produced to what's expected. And that includes both auditory targets and somatosensory targets for the speech sounds. Just to give you a feel of what the model's trying to control, this picture here is the articulatory synthesizer. The vocal tract in this is basically Shinji Maeda's 7 degree of freedom articulatory synthesizer. It has a jaw degree of freedom, 3 tongue movement degrees of freedom, 2 lip movement degrees of freedom, and a larynx height degree of freedom. And I'll just show random movements of the articulators, which is actually what we use for part of the learning process in the model, just so you can get a feel for what it sounds like and what the articulators look like. So this is just purely random movement of the articulators. This is where the model starts out. Of course, it sounds nothing like speech, but you can kind of hear the very beginnings of vowels, for example, in this. But this is just random movements. And we'll see that when we have trained the model, which is what I'll focus on in the first part of the talk, after training, what we do to produce a speech sound is we activate a cell in this speech sound map here at the top, and that will read out feed-forward commands, and it will also activate the feedback subsystem in a way that I'll describe, so that the overall motor command to the articulators is a combination of the feed-forward commands and feedback commands that occur if and only if there are errors in the productions. Okay, well, I think it's important in this context to highlight the relationship between the speech sound map cells in the model and mirror neurons. Now, the model was devised in 1992, and since the beginning it's had what we've called the speech sound map, which is a set of cells that we believe to exist in premotor cortex that are active during both perception and production of speech sounds. So we simplify this in our model. We just have one cell for each speech sound that is learned by the model, and that cell is activated when the model perceives the sound, and this is necessary for it to learn the sensory characteristics of that sound, but it's also activated when the model needs to produce that sound, and that happens by reading out first the learned sensory targets that were learned when the model first perceived the sound. So imagine a sound comes in, the model's never heard it, we activate a speech sound map cell, and we learn what that sound was like, and I'll call that the auditory goal region. It's a spatiotemporal region in auditory space that defines that sound, and it can be extracted directly from the sound sample presented to the model. Now, to a lesser degree, the model could also, or an infant could also presumably learn some somatosensory target aspects of sounds, particularly for the lips and the visible articulators, but the somatosensory characterization is not complete. You can't tell what's going on when somebody else speaks a new sound in terms of the tactile patterns, for example, in your vocal tract. That has to be learned later, so I've got dashed lines here to indicate that you can partially learn the somatosensory target as well at the beginning, but primarily the model learns this auditory target, and it's this auditory target in the feedback control system that's going to shape the gesture that will eventually be used to produce the speech sound. Okay, so first thing we have to do in the model is we have to tune up all these synaptic connections that I have shown in the model. And the first process that we do is not dependent on any particular speech sound. It's really just learning the physical relationships between movements of speech articulators, the sounds that are produced, and the somatic sensations that are produced. And that's done with a random babbling cycle. So we just activate random movements of the articulators, as I showed in the earlier video, and that generates somatosensory and auditory feedback for the system. So the system simultaneously has the motor commands that it generated, it has the somatosensory feedback that was created by those commands, and it has the auditory feedback that was created by those commands. And it uses this information to tune the synaptic projections that go from the auditory error map into corrective motor commands. So effectively what's learned here is if I want to move in this particular direction in auditory space, I need to activate this set of articulator movements, and that will move me in that direction. Similarly, if I need to get this particular somatosensory error fixed, I will need to move in a direction in somatosensory space. The model has learned now what articulator movements are necessary to move to that somatosensory target. And so all of this learning occurs without any knowledge of speech sounds, and we think of this as occurring in the very early stages of vocal play, even before the canonical babbling stage that infants start going through around 8 to 10 months, but also continuing through that stage. The next thing that the model needs to do is it needs to learn the projections I'm shown in red here, which are the auditory goals for a particular speech sound, the somatosensory goals for the speech sound, and a feed-forward command for the speech sound. And I've mentioned already that we use an imitation process involving these speech sound map cells, or the mirror neurons in the model, which involves, first of all, learning on auditory targets. So we will present the model with something like a ba sound in form and frequency space can be plotted as follows. This is time, this is frequency, and each of these bands codes an acceptable range for a formant frequency. So this is the first formant frequency, this is the second formant frequency, and this is the third formant frequency. And together this forms the auditory target for a ba. And the model learns that simply by being given an example or a number of examples. If you give it several examples, it can learn the ranges of acceptable variability on each of these dimensions, and it will use that as a target region later for production. The second part of the imitation process involves attempting to produce the sound, and by doing so, slowly tuning up the feed-forward commands in the model so that the feedback system doesn't need to be used later. And we've heard about problems that occur with trying to control systems with feedback that's delayed. The auditory and somatosensory feedback information is delayed somewhere between 50 and 150 milliseconds before it gets back up to the cortex. And that's too slow for planning speech movements. If you wait until the sound corresponding to your current command comes back in, it's too late. You should have already generated a number of commands before that, since many of the speech sounds, like the syllable ba, for example, don't last much longer than the entire delay loop would take. So the 150 milliseconds, you need to have already read out the whole command before you start even hearing that. And we know that people can do this, and we know that people can speak without any auditory feedback. These things indicate that they do have a feed-forward control system, and this is what the model is trying to learn in this second stage of learning. And so it learns the auditory target, and then on the first production, what the model does is it relies very heavily on auditory feedback control, because the feed-forward commands, see if I have a picture of the model nearby here. No, well, the feed-forward commands are poorly tuned, and so that means that there will be a lot of auditory error. And so corrective commands will come in, they'll be a little bit late, so on the current production they may not be particularly useful, but these are incorporated into the feed-forward command that the model uses on the next attempt. So the feedback system is slowly tuning up the feed-forward system by giving it corrective commands that are then incorporated into the feed-forward command. And here's what it sounds like. In this case, we give the model a sound sample that sounds like this.
Good doggy.
The words good doggy. The model stores that. This next slide shows basically as a spectrogram what that looks like. So this is the first formant frequency, the second formant frequency, and the third formant frequency. This is effectively stored in the synaptic weights from this mirror neuron that was activated when it heard the sound to the auditory, higher order auditory representation of the sound itself. So basically what's happening is I'm learning the target that I want to produce when I try to produce this sound. Well, the first attempt that the model makes, in this case, it does not have a feed-forward command. It's never attempted to produce this before, so it doesn't know exactly what commands to generate. So it relies on that auditory feedback system to generate the sound, and you'll hear it sounds okay, but it's kind of sloppy sounding, and this is due to the delays in the feedback loop, basically.
Good doggy. Good doggy.
So in this case, that's the first attempt. Right, and the reason that it does well is because we have a very well-tuned mapping between auditory errors and what articulations should fix those errors, and we know what the auditory target is. The only problem is that we have this lag between the commands and the actual output, so this delay in the feedback loop causes a little bit of sloppiness in the production. Now, the model does better than an infant may do on the first attempt for something like this, but the model doesn't have noise in the neurons and so forth. It can learn things perfectly in many instances where it would take an infant much longer to learn something. Okay, so that was the first production. Now what happens on the next production? The next production, the auditory feedback commands that were generated on the first production have now been subsumed into the feed-forward command. So the feed-forward command on the second production is really basically what the feedback commands were on the first production, but this time it doesn't have to wait for the auditory feedback. There still is a little bit of error, and that's because of the delays again in the loop. I can't go into the details of that, but there is still some residual error, which means that the auditory feedback system is still kicking in, but on the second attempt it doesn't have to kick in as much because the sound sounds quite a bit better already.
Good doggy.
And then the model keeps repeating this, and each time it gets better and better, and by the sixth or seventh iteration, it's pretty much at asymptote. It sounds as good as it's going to sound for that particular sound.
Good doggy.
And at this case, Sure, sure.
Sorry. If the prosody is different, or is the model cannot make it?
Oh, what the model does is just imitates directly the prosody that's given to it. We have not modeled the control of prosody. We've concentrated on the segmental aspects of the speech signal, so the formant frequencies. The prosody, all we've done is just make our voicing parameters match what the speaker did when in the example that we gave it. It just imitates directly. It just stores the prosodic profile that was given to it. Right, so it heard that, in this case, it only heard it with one prosodic profile, so it just stored that prosodic profile, and that's what's used to do the voicing. We haven't concentrated on the control of the vocal folds, where really the supraglottal vocal tract is what we've concentrated on. So the shaping of the sound by articulatory gestures is what we've focused on. So it's just kind of a kludge, as we say, that we just copy what was given to it. Yes?
It's not clear to me how you deal in the model with line evolution. I mean, if you have a longer or shorter sentence,
well, what it does, right now, we always give it, if we give it several bars, we make sure they're the same length. So it just stores an auditory target that's of that length for ba in this case.
The production would be roughly the same length.
Yes, it produces at the same length. It actually can lengthen it by about 150 milliseconds simply because the feedback loop is still kicking in at the end, potentially. But it's basically the same length of production. So, yeah.
And what happens, sorry, if you present some new phoneme? For example, some, let's say, Arabic straight or...
If you give it a new phoneme, what it will do is it will activate a new mirror neuron or speech sound map cell. That will learn the auditory trajectory for that phoneme, so it'll learn what the formant frequencies were, and then it will practice and will be able to produce that phoneme.
It's necessary that this model practice
It needs to...
in order to reach the nice result.
Right, so it learns the auditory target right away, but to produce it properly, it has to practice it several times before it tunes up the feed-forward command, basically. Does that answer the question?
I understood. Maybe we can discuss.
Okay, I'll keep going and make become more clear. Okay, well this just shows the spectrograms that were produced by the model on the first few attempts, and I only show this to highlight that in the first attempt we can see things like overshoots and then it comes back down, and this is directly the result of delays in the feedback loop, and it doesn't match the original signal very well, but with each attempt it gets better and better, and by the sixth attempt the formant frequencies, which is all that the model concentrates on, the auditory space for this model is F1, F2, F3, the three formant frequencies. That's all it's really focusing on. Those are pretty much exactly as they were in the sample that it was given.
I'm sorry. To deal with the amplitude, with the intensity variation here, is that done?
Well, F1 really gives us a ton of information about that. So it's doing the F1 trace, and F1 goes to near zero at closure, and that shuts down the production. And we're producing the sound with the vocal tract synthesizer. So when, if F1 drives the tongue to close the vocal tract, the synthesizer quits making sound. Okay, well, that's functionally, in a nutshell, the basics of the model. Now what I'll talk about is the neural component of the model in more detail. And what we have done is we've come up with a stereotactic coordinate for every cell in the model, basically. And here I've shown most of these that are visible on the lateral surface of the cerebral cortex. And we've gone through the literature on where different representations are, and we've localized all the motor and somatosensory portions of the model in the appropriate places along the Rolandic cortex. And we also have auditory representation in the superior temporal gyrus, and then some of the components of the model we had to hypothesize where they would be. And these include the error cells for the auditory system, which we hypothesized were in areas that have been identified for both speech perception and production, including the planum temporale and the posterior superior temporal gyrus, and somatosensory error cells, which we hypothesized to exist in the higher order somatosensory cortex in the supramarginal gyrus behind the representation of the speech articulators. And finally, the speech sound map cells, which we originally had just vaguely said were in premotor cortex. With the discovery of the mirror neurons by Luciano and colleagues, we were very pleased to see this because we needed those things in the model. and we knew now more specifically where they should be, and we've localized them basically to Brodmann's area 44 in only the left hemisphere. All of the other components of the model are bilateral, but we believe this speech sound map is actually left lateralized, and this is based on functional imaging results of simple sound production. So people producing just a single syllable, we actually see left lateralized Brodmann area 44 activation, but bilateral activation in all the other areas drawn up on this slide. So once we've localized each of the components of the model to the cerebral cortex in a standard stereotactic frame, now it's quite easy to compare the results of our computer simulations, the activities of the neurons during the simulations, to fMRI results and PET results. And all we do is we take the neural activity, which we think of as the membrane potential or of the neuron, we run it through a hemodynamic response function, which basically gives us a simulated blood flow, and we use that simulated blood flow to determine when there's more flow in one condition versus another. And we can plot it on the brain like we did over here, just like the results of an fMRI study. We, in fact, use the exact same plotting package, SPM, that we use for the fMRI analysis, so we can do very direct comparisons between the model activations, which are shown over here, in this case for producing CV syllables, and this is the results of an fMRI experiment for human subject 10 human subjects producing CV syllables. And we see there's a pretty good correspondence. And when we find discrepancies, we use these to fine-tune the model to help improve the model. Now, this slide with the good correspondence isn't particularly surprising at this point because we used many of the existing fMRI studies to determine where the components were in the first place. What's far more interesting is, can we make some predictions based on the model that have not been shown in existing fMRI studies, and then test those predictions in fMRI? And I'll talk about two key studies that we've done in this domain, and these have to do with the feedback control subsystem. In particular, we did an auditory perturbation fMRI experiment, which Joe very briefly alluded to, and we did a somatosensory perturbation fMRI experiment, and now I'll go through and describe the motivation for these experiments and the results. Well, let's go back to the model's feedback control system. One aspect of the feedback control system is the fact that we have these targets. We have for each speech sound, we have a learned auditory target and a learned somatosensory target. And these, we believe, are instantiated by projections from cells in the premotor cortical areas over to the higher order sensory areas. So the higher order somatosensory cortex in the supramarginal gyrus, and the higher order auditory cortex in the posterior portions of the superior temporal gyrus and the planum temporale. And we believe that there are cortical projections, but there are also projections that go through a cerebellar loop. So they project to the pons, to the cerebellar cortex, the deep cerebellar nuclei, to the thalamus, and back up to the cortex. And I've just schematized this with a single projection through the cerebellum. But the idea is that cortical and cerebellar projections are both being sent over to these areas, and together they represent the expected sound or the expected somatic sense. Now, these are then mapped into, if there's an error, if there's a difference between what I expect and what I hear or what I feel, I map those into corrective movement commands through projections that go from these higher order sensory areas back over to the motor areas in the model. Okay, well, this makes a clear-cut prediction. I said that the feed-forward command becomes good enough that it by itself can produce the speech sound with very little error. And in an adult, this is what we expect, that we wouldn't see much activation in the error maps under normal speaking conditions. However, if we change your auditory feedback so that you actually hear something different than what you tried to say, that should activate cells in the auditory error map, and these should in turn activate the motor cortex to correct for that error. In other words, we should highlight this auditory feedback system, and we can test whether it's in the areas that we expect. So what we did was an fMRI study of unexpected auditory perturbation during speech. Joe already talked a bit about this, so I'm not going to go into the details, but basically what happens is a subject saying bet, get, and every now and then we make the bet in real time, and within 15 milliseconds delay, make it sound like bat or bit. And in those cases, we expect to see a much elevated activation of the auditory error cells, and we expect to see some motor corrective commands. So we did an fMRI experiment doing this, and one nice thing about this model is we can we span basically the behavioral and the neural levels. We can look at the productions of the model, but we can also look at the brain activations of the model, so to speak. These are the productions of the model compared to the subject's productions, and what's shown here is normalized F1. So when there's no perturbation, F1 is at 1 here. With a downward perturbation, the subjects, which are shown by the gray area here, this is the confidence interval for the subjects, they shift their speech upward to compensate for the downward shift, and vice versa in the case of the upward shift. And these solid lines here, this solid line and this dashed line, show the model productions under the same conditions. When we unexpectedly perturb the model's auditory feedback, after about 100 milliseconds, we start to see the corrective commands kick in, and they go in the opposite direction of the perturbation. So the model's productions, we can see, fall within the confidence intervals of the subjects, so we have a good quantitative fit to the behavioral data. And this slide shows the fMRI results compared to the fMRI that we predicted from the model by just running the experiment and simulating the fMRI. Most notably, we see that we get a lot of activation just where we thought it would be in these posterior superior temporal gyrus areas that we identify with the auditory error cells. And we also see frontal activation in the motor cortical areas and a little bit in front of that. But interestingly, the model had predicted bilateral frontal activation in this case, but we only found unilateral activation, right lateralized activation. And this is interesting to us, A, because it helps us fix the model, but B, because it suggests that auditory feedback control is actually right lateralized in the frontal cortex as compared to feed-forward control, which we believe is more left lateralized in the cortex. And this is very interesting relative to certain communication disorders, such as stuttering, because in many communication disorders, in fMRI experiments, especially for stuttering, you see a lot more right frontal activation. And we had hypothesized earlier that stuttering was the result of a poor feed-forward system causing an over-reliance on auditory feedback control. Well, this makes perfect sense. If they're over-relying on auditory feedback control, we'll have more right hemisphere motor activation. So this not only supports the model, but also gives us information to fine-tune the model and gives us some insight into some communication disorders.
So
Yes.
the cerebellum is right or left, the activation of the cerebellum?
This is actually in the right inferior cerebellum, and this is interesting to us because
Strange, because it's lateral to the cortex. It's very strange.
right, it's in the same side, right, as the activation here. This right inferior cerebellum, it's in lobule 8, and that's actually connected up heavily with the left prefrontal cortex.
Exactly.
And
It's very strange.
yeah, and we don't really know what to make of that, because we expected, if there were cerebellar activation, we expected it in the superior cerebellum, which is what we think has more of the motor control aspects of this going on.
The other interesting thing is that this is not the area 44 what we found, but this is at the border between 6 and 44.
This is, right, and we actually did a more fine-grained ROI analysis. 44, 6, and 4 are all actually active in this case, all in the right and not in the left.
Are these data published already?
Well, there's a short description of it in a Journal of Communication Disorders paper that came out last year. We just submitted the long version a couple of weeks ago, so we're waiting for the results. Okay, so good news is that that prediction seems to largely be held up. The second prediction that we made was that if we unexpectedly block the jaw, this is a somatosensory disruption that should cause a somatosensory error, which should lead to corrective motor commands. And depending on how bad the jaw block was, it may lead to some auditory error. So we might expect to see some auditory cortex activation as well in the auditory error cells. So we tested this by building a machine that we call the perturbatron. And what the perturbatron does is it basically very rapidly blows a balloon up in your mouth while you're trying to speak. So normally it's deflated, it's no problem, you're speaking away. 1 out of every 7 trials, we blow the balloon up, it blows up a couple of centimeters, it blocks the jaw in a wide open position. People actually compensate for that very well. The speech sounds fine. The model can compensate for that sort of thing very well. We focused a lot in the early years on dealing with perturbations and so forth. And what it allows us to do is in the fMRI environment, we can actually test the prediction of unexpected blocking of the jaw. Does that activate error cells in the supramarginal gyrus? Of course, we ran the experiment. Here are the model simulations that we had done beforehand. And here are the experimental results we get. One very nice thing is we do get the supramarginal gyrus activation. I should point out that this is at a very strict threshold. there was quite a bit more activation if we relaxed the threshold to like 0.05. Here we use 0.001, and that's just to highlight the peaks of the activation we see. And these peaks of activation fall right in the supramarginal gyrus behind the speech articulator. So again, this supports the model. The model's corrective responses were actually peaking in the motor cortex. We found the peak to actually be closer to the area 44 here. We did see a lot of activation in the motor cortex at the lower threshold, but the peak is actually at a higher level than we expected, and it's left lateralized. This is something we had not anticipated and something that we're now incorporating into the model. So, but the main predictions of somatosensory air cells and supramarginal gyrus and corrective motor commands were borne out in this experiment. So the last thing I'll talk about now is the feed-forward control system, and I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly. I just mainly want to highlight what we think the feed-forward system is and where we think it is in the brain. This diagram shows where we think it is in the brain. These are our speech sound map cells here in the premotor areas and 44. We think that there are direct projections from these areas down to primary motor cortex, and there are also transcerebellar connections from these areas to the primary motor cortex, and that these commands are the feed-forward commands. These are the ones that don't rely on any sort of monitoring of what you're doing. So they're pre-learned commands that are just read out pretty much straight as they were learned previously. Well, the overall command in the model is actually a combination of the feed-forward command and the feedback commands, but over the course of learning, there's a natural progression of using more and more of the feed-forward command, because as the feed-forward command gets better, it starts eliminating the auditory and somatosensory errors, and that naturally shuts down the auditory and somatosensory feedback control systems, and eventually the feed-forward command does pretty much all of the work by itself under normal conditions without perturbations. Well, this just describes the development. Now, the interaction that we have between the feed-forward and feedback commands make several interesting predictions that we tested with an adaptation experiment, and these predictions are listed here. First of all, if a speaker's auditory feedback is perturbed consistently over many consecutive productions of a syllable, so instead of just unexpectedly perturbing every now and then, we perturb every single time they produce the syllable, the model predicts that the corrections from the auditory system should become incorporated into the feed-forward command, so the feed-forward command should actually change. The speakers with better hearing, as Joe mentioned earlier, will adapt more than speakers with worse hearing. I'm not really going to talk much about that. That was borne out, as Joe talked about this morning. And finally, if we remove the perturbation suddenly, we should actually see after effects, meaning that the productions after the removal of the perturbation are actually incorrect now because they were trying to compensate for the perturbation, so they're actually going to show some after effects that will only slowly go away as the model practices a few more productions. Well, Joe talked about the sensory motor adaptation study where we did just what I described. We systematically changed the first formant frequency while subjects said things like bet and peck. We gradually ramped that up. We held it on for a long time, and then we shut it off to see if we could find after effects. This slide shows the results. This is for the subject that had a downward shift. This is for the subjects that had an upward shift. The lines with the error bars are the subject data, and the gray areas are 95% confidence intervals from simulations of the model. What we did was we produced one version of the model for every single subject based on their auditory acuity. So some versions of the model had really small auditory targets, as Joe had discussed, because the people had good auditory acuity. Others had poor auditory acuity and therefore larger targets. And this leads to the range of productions we see here in the model. But what we can see is that the model's productions are statistically indistinguishable from those of the subjects in the experiment. And also we capture this idea that subjects that hear better will compensate more. This dashed line shows a version of the model that had bad hearing or large targets, and you see it doesn't compensate very much. The solid line here shows a version of the model that had very good hearing and that therefore compensated quite a lot. So again, we have a very nice quantitative account of what happens in this experiment, and I think this provides some pretty strong support for our view of how feedback and feed-forward systems are being integrated in speech production.
Why is it asymmetric?
That only has to do with the way we did the perturbation. Basically, we had a perturbation factor that was either 0.7 or 1.3, where 1.0 was no perturbation. To compensate, you have to basically do the reciprocal of that, and the reciprocal of 1 over 1 of 0.7 is just bigger than the reciprocal of, yeah, it's an oversight. But yeah, so it's not anything special, it's just physics, basically. Okay, so, well, I already described that, so now I'll just go into my summary. I've talked now a lot about the DIVA model and how it elucidates several types of learning and speech acquisition. For example, there's the learning of general relationships between articulations and their sensory consequences, both acoustic and somatosensory. There's another learning stage where auditory targets are learned, and there's another stage where feed-forward commands are learned, as well as somatosensory targets. I didn't talk too much about those, but they are also learned during the practice phase. It elucidates the interactions between motor, somatosensory, and auditory areas responsible for speech-motor control. So in this sense, I think it does form a neural theory of speech-motor control, at least, certainly not a neural theory of language, but I would hope that it would be compatible with what would come about from a neural theory of language, that some of the same components may well be represented there. And importantly for us, the model spans behavioral and neural levels and makes predictions that we can test using a variety of experimental techniques. And I've only talked about a small number of these, but we've done a very large number of these experiments over the years, thanks in large part to Joe's lab and their EMMA system measuring articulator movements. And I'd just like to close by trying to reconcile the two main kind of competing views of speech production. And these are the gestural view, which we've heard a lot about, and the auditory view, which Joe described in this morning's talk. Now, in our model, the auditory target is the primary thing that shapes the gesture, but there are gestures in the model, and I would say that what the gestural score is, as described in the Haskins laboratory work, is the feed-forward component of speech production. What we call the feed-forward commands, I think of as the gestures. These are the articulatory gestures, but they're not in isolation. They're always being used in combination with an auditory feedback control system and a somatosensory feedback control system. And these control systems shape these gestures constantly. So if there's any change, if my articulators grow as I get bigger, it can keep up with these changes and keep tuning up the gestures so they make the appropriate sounds. So it gives us a way of reconciling this auditory nature of speech, which is very intuitive. There's something auditory about speech, no doubt, but also gives a way of interpreting, at least, or thinking about the gestural aspects of speech. And I would contend that the gestural aspects of speech production are these feed-forward commands that are used for speech production. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. One there. John, and then.
I like very much this last slide because it could be that the fighting between the two communities was simply due to a false problem. So let's imagine to translate this into the visual motor domain for hand action recognition.
Right.
For sure, when I see a hand action, I visually perceive that, so I use the visual signal in order to understand what happens. And there could be some hypotheses which say, in order to understand, I need the motor representation of this action, because the visual input is so changing, for example, depending upon the point of view, that I cannot use it as an invariant signal in order to recognize the action.
Right, and it goes away sometimes.
Exactly, and this is exactly the same point. So in other terms, in order to reconcile the two points of view, we need elements in the brain which at the same time are activated by both the visual and the motor signals.
Yes.
We need these elements. So in other terms, the story of the mirror neurons could be used not only to create very complex theory about understanding of intentions or theory of mind or philosophical ideas about simulation, but they are just necessary because without this element, which at the same time respond to the two aspects, we cannot reconcile the two points of views. I don't know which is your opinion, but I think this is a fundamental
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would say that the mirror neurons we have here are the stupidest mirror neurons in the brain. All they do is tune up the motor system, basically, and are used for the production of the motor system. I suspect that there are similar things going on at much higher levels. Regarding the two types of information being simultaneously used, there's some clear evidence of that from perturbation experiments in both the visual domain and the auditory domain. They're actually completely analogous. Wolpert and colleagues did an experiment where subjects were reaching back and forth between two targets, and then their visual input was slowly bent in the middle so that they actually saw themselves making curves. Well, they started compensating by curving it in the other direction, even though they didn't consciously notice this. But interestingly, they don't entirely compensate for that. Similarly, when we do the auditory perturbation experiments, like John Hood's original experiment and the ones we've done, subjects compensate, but they don't entirely compensate. And what I think is happening, and what happens in the model doesn't compensate entirely either. What happens is, as I start compensating for the auditory curvature, as I try to straighten that out, I start pulling myself away from my somatosensory target that I've learned from all the other productions. So the somatosensory target actually starts tugging me back in the opposite direction eventually. So I don't go all the way to a straight line in visual space or a perfectly produced auditory signal. I go toward that, but I can't go all the way because as I move toward that, the somatosensory feedback system starts trying to pull me back because it thinks that I'm doing it wrong now. So you kind of reach this balance between the two systems. They're both active at all times. Well, they're both active generally, but you can lose the auditory or the visual information and still use the somatosensory and the feed-forward information.
Thank you very much for this magnificent demonstration of this artificial system.
Thanks.
And this is actually my area of interest. And just to make sure that I still have a job when I go back home, let me make some questions about this. So, exactly how big of a repertoire of phonemes and syllables have you been able to make with this model?
It's kind of unlimited. I mean, it can easily learn vowels. There's some limitations in the articulatory synthesizer that make some consonants difficult to produce, but we can build larger and larger chunks. So another thing that I didn't focus on is that a speech sound to the model isn't necessarily a phoneme. And in fact, the more canonical speech sounds are syllables, I think. But anything that you say over and over again, so a word that you repeat, your name, if it's a two-syllable word, may be represented by kind of a single chunk in the motor system. And so we can make arbitrarily long chunks, or we can change the form of frequency. So there's no limit on how many we can make. There are limits on which ones we can make simply because the synthesizer has limitations in what kind of movements it can do.
Okay, so this would lead me to the question to how do you define an auditory target?
Well, so what happens in the model is that we give it a unit. We just tell it this is a unit, and that unit could be a syllable or it could be good doggy, as in the case I gave it before, and it just activates a new mirror neuron or a new speech sound map for that unit if it doesn't recognize it. And so basically it's because it's given it as a unit. So we don't deal with the segmentation problem. That's an extremely difficult problem that infants have to deal with. We pre-segment the units for it. We just give it the unit, it learns that unit. That unit could be a syllable, could be a phoneme, could be an entire phrase even.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering with you use auditory targets, but some auditory targets, if they are given by children or women, it might not be possible for. Do you do any normalization?
Yes, we have done some normalization, and that's also another difficult problem that we basically kind of brush by. The problem he's referring to is that the form and frequencies for an infant are dramatically different than for an adult. There are some transformations you can do to normalize them that work very well for vowels. They don't seem to work as well for consonants, the simple transformations. I personally believe that somewhere in the brain there is this representation that's speaker independent that has a rich representation of the spectrum, but the absolute values of the frequencies don't, it can deal with the low frequencies of an adult male and the high frequencies of a child by normalizing them into the same spectrotemporal space. And I'll even tell you where I think it is. I think it's in the planum temporale and the posterior superior temporal gyrus.
Can I make a First, a comment to Frank said that really it's the very first time that we have a kind of realistic or plausible model of a relationship between perception, action, and brain, and that's absolutely great.
Well, thanks.
And also comment that the view that you have of the relationship between perception and action, of course, fits quite well with what I think, and I find it quite interesting. I would like to say that in relationship to the comment by Friedemann that finally we do not necessarily enter the brain by the various views we have on speech, I think that you show quite clearly that if you have a theory in which the connection between perception and actions is a necessary requirement for both the perception of the production, you necessarily enter into a theory of speech in the brain.
Right.
And I had a question for both you and Joe. I had the same at the beginning of the talk about your work on adaptation and the relationship between the auditory acuity and the production. And I was wondering if you couldn't say the thing the other way around. That is that if for certain idiosyncratic reasons a given speaker has a more precise production or a smaller difference between two competing sounds in his repertoire, this could then produce in his perception better discrimination. Did you explore this question?
We have not looked at that. One talk I've seen, or paper I've seen recently that did kind of address that was by Hiroya, and what he noted was that perception, your ability to discriminate things actually correlates not so much with where the categories are in your language, the auditory categories, but with the movement distances of the articulators that are used to produce that acoustic distinction. So I think what that highlights is that I've talked a lot about how the perceptual system shapes the motor system. I think that highlights that the perceptual dimensions are actually shaped by your motor experience. And we just assume a particular auditory space, but the auditory space of a French speaker is different from the auditory space of an English speaker. We've done some separate work on how these spaces kind of develop in the auditory cortex, but this is another very important issue. And I personally believe that, yes, that the auditory dimensions we have are partially the result of what our particular speech mechanism does. And one good reason for that is that we need to tune up our own speech mechanism, so we need a very rich representation of that mechanism.
I wanted to ask a bit of a technical question, but
Sure.
I'm interested in the learning mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you, for example, you have your error, so your system computes the error between the prediction and what you actually perceive.
Right.
And this error is used to modify a set of synaptic weights, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
So the connection between that area,
Mm-hmm.
exactly, right.
Yeah, these are learned very early on. These are not adjusted later. So once these are tuned, well, that's not true actually. They're adjusted but very slowly. The feed-forward learning is the faster learning here. And what happens is these neurons just add up what's coming from here and what's coming from here. So they're just adders basically. And what these synaptic projections do is they just learn what that activation was. So I activate this speech sound map cell. It learns, okay, here was what I saw there. That was partly from what I read out from my feed-forward command, but it also had some component that was due to this feedback. Well, if I just adjust my weights to reflect the new activation in motor cortex on this current attempt, so I use it on the next attempt, then that's that learning. And it's just you can do that with simple Hebbian type learning, for example.
Right, but do you actually use Hebbian learning in this?
We've done so many versions of the model over the years. When I first started out, I paid a lot of attention to biological plausibility of the learning loss because I came from a neural network background. But I learned that nobody cared about that in the speech community. So, and there are faster ways of doing things than biologically plausible learning laws, at least for computers. So we've used all kinds of different learning systems. We've used radio basis function learning techniques. I think the important thing is that we've shown that you can instantiate these with biologically plausible learning algorithms, and all it does is that, if anything, it slows down the learning. But as is, the model learns much faster than a child, I believe.
And the other thing was, do you assume that so in between your maps you have these connections?
Yep.
And do you assume that every unit is connected to all other units?
That depends on the map, and I've simplified a couple of these maps. So for example, there's also this cerebellar component that I don't have drawn up on here. So generally it is the case that every unit goes to every other unit, but a couple, yeah, actually all of these maps, every unit goes to every other unit.
And sorry, finally, just very quickly, is that a bidirectional connection, the arrow going down, or is it one direction?
In the model, these are all unidirectional. I believe in the brain, the directions go both ways, and I believe that this relates also to the idea of the motor system affecting the sensory system and vice versa. But this is a model of speech motor control, so we've concentrated on that direction.
Thanks.
The very last quick question.
It's just follow up on Jonas' question about this speaker normalization. It appeared to me that you were suggesting that you would be prepared to put some sort of algorithm in the system that would, or assuming that there would be some sort of a basic biological way of connecting the sounds from the different sounds from the speakers with different sizes and so. But I think that this is problematic because you have to know where that algorithm comes from and to have a motivation for that. And one thing that I've been proposing, I don't know with how much success within the Contact project, is that the way to solve this in a more ecologically relevant way would be to have to go back to the essentials of using language, well, speech, to refer to things outside. So if you go out from the representation of sound in itself and connect that with similar representations but of visual objects, then you have an automatic mapping between different
It's like a
yeah.
map.
So you have a third element here that is often forgotten, which will lead to an emergent process that will make that computation. But the computation is not there really to begin with. It's some sort of a...
Well, I think there's one shortcoming of that viewpoint, and that is, how is it then that I can use very fine aspects of the acoustic signal of a different speaker to tune up my motor system when I need to know how that relates to my own motor system, so I need to kind of strip out the fact that this was a...
Yeah, but you do that later. Actually, the work that Lisa has been doing in... we are looking at imitation in our lab, and one thing that you realize is that what adults accept as a successful imitation from an infant to what they had said depends critically on what they assume to be the size or the of that infant. Because in the beginning they will accept almost anything, just the time, as long as the pattern of intensity matches more or less, they will say this is fine. But as the infant grows older, then they demand more and more. So this is a
yeah, I think of that more as a fine-tuning of the motor system. But I think everything you're saying is compatible with this view, which is that the auditory information comes in, and the primary auditory cortex is a big difference between adult and child speech, because those cells care about absolute frequency. I suggest that this is transformed through stages up to the highest levels of the auditory system, where at some point in the dorsal stream of the auditory system, the stream that is involved in the motor control aspects, at some point what you're left with is a very rich representation of the spectrum, but it has subtracted out this vocal tract length. So I think there are many levels. So certainly we can still hear the difference between a child and an adult, and that's probably because we're using primary auditory cortex in other areas, but not so much this this representation. But the representation I'm talking about, I feel, is necessary for tuning up the speech motor system, and I think it's extremely helpful for speech perception as well. In fact, I think it's not I don't think it's absolutely necessary for perception, but it would be very helpful to have it for speech perception.
Okay. So clearly we could go on discussing for hours, but I'm afraid we need to close the session here and actually the workshop. Let's thank the speaker again. And before we all leave, Laila would like a few more questions. Or?
I'm going to say everything now. Just so first of all, here we have the timetable of the shuttle buses to the airport, subdivided in 2 days. So each of you can take its own. And the second point was the fact that in few days it will be possible to find on the web, at the contact web page or at the Krill web page, the complete recordings of all the workshop here. And if somebody will need the DVD, just ask, please. We will be happy to provide it. And as far as the possibility to publish the contribution, we are now checking this possibility. We are trying to understand if speakers are available in writing papers now and how many of them, so we will be contacted. Then that could be another possibility. However, the speakers maybe will receive a message in order to ask for more complex or simpler things. Okay, then I really would thank everybody for having participated to this workshop, which was a unique occasion for to meet together so different disciplines on one same topic. I tried indeed to make a list of different disciplines that were present here. Linguists, psycholinguists, computer scientists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, roboticians, neuropsychologists, developmental psychologists, social linguists, engineers, and sorry if I have forgotten something. So for sure, we go back home richer than before. And finally, I would like really to thank all the speakers and all the discussants for the respect and the elegance with which they have given, they have received positive and negative comments. So thank you very much. And now I gave the microphone to Barbara for the last technical information on especially the visit to the Krill lab. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, I think you remember there's this visit in the afternoon, so we're going to leave from the President Hotel in 1 hour, 1 hour 15, so basically 2:45. And I'd like to basically know how many of you may be interested in that, just in order to organize something. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. The shuttle bus, you have to check on the yeah, that's it. Always concerning the lab, I really wanted to say you something. Yesterday, I think you managed to understand that it's an environment for interdisciplinary research, but interdisciplinary research is not there if there is no interdisciplinary knowledge. So if you or your students feel like coming to lecture for a period, we will be happy to have you here and to grow up with your collaboration. So that was the main message. And finally, I really need to thank our staff for organizing everything. So Francesco Sigona, Bianca Sisini, Angelica Costagliola, Luigina Garrapa, and Gabriele Nicolardi, all the people that were actually making it possible. Thank you very much again to all the speakers and everyone.